we're very happy to welcome our four speakers here, Dr. Zulfia Abawe, Dr. Haqmal Daudzai, Bilquees Daud, and Moheb Jabarkhail. So thanks a lot for coming, first of all, and warm welcome to you. My name is Miszak. I'm Senior Program Officer in Afghanistan Focal Point at swisspeace, and I will be moderating this roundtable, which I should point out at the very start will be recorded as well and is hybrid. This is also why I'm sitting here in front of the camera, so we have people joining us virtually as well. Just for the program, we have the four speakers. They will all present papers roughly for 15 minutes each. And this will be followed then by a question and answer session. The way we will do it is we will alternate between on-site and virtual. So we will take a question from here and then go to the virtual space if there's a question there. So you have plenty of opportunity to ask questions. Now, before I hand over to the speakers, 2 points also from my side. We would like to thank the leading house, South Asia and Iran at the Zurich University for Applied Science for supporting this event. Also a very, very big thank you to the statehood team at swisspeace, especially Dr. Farouk Yousaf and Mireille Graf, not from the statehood, but from the continuous education team, also Metka from the research team for supporting and making this event happen. So thanks a lot to you. A few sentences also on swisspeace for those of you who are not very familiar with this organization. We are a research and a practice institute located here at Basel and dedicated to advancing effective peace building, reducing violence and promoting peace in contexts which are affected by conflict, and usually with local partners and other international actors together. So as an organization, we have been, let's say, working on Afghanistan since 2001. So we have some time we've been engaging with Afghanistan as an organization, mostly working together with Afghan civil society at the subnational levels. And I think an important starting point was in 2002 when swisspeace set up the Afghan Civil Society Forum in partnership with participants of the Afghan Civil Society Conference, which was held in Bad Honnef in December 2001, which was in parallel to the Bonn Conference on the hill, they used to say. So the Bonn Conference on the hill and civil society was at the bottom of the hill, which was always a very telling example of how things were at the time, but this was a bit for swisspeace, one of the starting points for the engagement with Afghanistan, and we're still very much engaged in Afghanistan today. But of course, we are also very we have many questions on as to pick up the title on the way forward. So how to now work in Afghanistan, how to engage with Afghanistan, and with whom. So these are some of the questions also for us as an organization, and we're very happy to have this event to at least speak to some of these points with our four speakers. And so with that, I will not take much longer, but immediately hand over to Dr. Zulfia Abawe. And I had asked them to introduce themselves, so I will not say more about them, but they will speak and say what they want about where they come from, their background to you, so you can contextualize. So please, thanks.
Thank you so much, Nick, for that wonderful introduction at the beginning. So about myself, I just want to make sure I don't speak too fast. I know that's a problem. I was born in Afghanistan, so I call myself a multilingual, multicultural, and multidisciplinary trained academic. And this is why I was born in Afghanistan. I did my high school in Pakistan, and then I went back to Afghanistan to do my bachelor's in business. And then I went to Germany. I did a master's in public policy, and then I went to the UK. I'm a dual citizen, an Afghan-British, and I did a master's in human rights law from the UK. And then I went to the United States to do I did a Ph.D. from the United States. So I have that awareness of 5 different education systems. I'm fortunate that before I came to this event, yesterday I was offered a permanent lectureship at the University of South Wales, where I was teaching, but on a temporary contract. And my upbringing mostly, I would say, it has been in an Afghan family, which obviously there's this image of being very conservative and things, but I was very fortunate that I had a liberal parents especially, who made me travel, and I've been to over 18 countries. Again, I was fortunate to speak to leaders, especially young leaders from across the world. And this all happened because of my parents' encouragement. My mother is not an educated woman, but sometimes my sibling says, like, look at an uneducated woman has got a doctorate, like a PhD daughter. So I gave all the credit to my mother because she has been extremely encouraging throughout this process. And that's a little bit about myself, and also for the past few years I've been living in Wales and in the UK. Shall I start my topic, or do you want the panel to introduce themselves first?
No, please go ahead. So
I did my PhD in law and democracy. My PhD dissertation was looking at legal pluralism in Afghanistan. Some of the patterns that I identified as part of my PhD is going to be applicable today. The topic I'll be discussing today is something new, and I got very passionate after the fall of Kabul to the Taliban in August. And there came this question over and over again, why Afghanistan should matter, especially why Afghanistan should matter to the West. Of course, there's like so many different ways of looking at this question. And my colleagues in the panel today, they will be touching upon those different perspectives. One of the ways which I am looking at this question is from an international security perspective. And I'm sure there will be experts who knows more than myself, and also maybe people who are watching me now. But this is I just want to say this is something which I'm hoping I can take it further. And my question here is that how I can fit Afghanistan in the international security paradigm. Or if I rephrase this question, why Afghanistan is important to global security or international security? And being trained as an academic, of course, we always look into existing literature and see what other positions are in there. Is there anybody else who have touched upon this question? And the answer is no. So I had to do that really raw research in the beginning. So I looked at the literature on international security. I identified a pattern in international security. When it comes to international security, it's either that traditional way of looking at international security or non-traditional way of looking at international security. So what do I mean by this? The traditional approach to international security takes national interest at its heart. How they're going to achieve it is through military. So militaristic thinking dominates the traditional approach. And when it comes to the theories, it's a realist approach. Of course, it's always, when they look at the politics, it's like self-interest matters. If you're on a table speaking to somebody, you have your self-interest in mind. And the same applies with states. And this approach also says that the actors in this process are statesmen, diplomats, and generals. Moving on to the non-traditional security. Non-traditional security is mostly argued that it's based or informed by liberal theories. What does it mean? It's not just about the national interest of the country. It's not just about their people. It's not about their territory. It's about human beings in general. And that's where this concept of human security comes in. So it's not just national security, it's also human security. So it actually expands that space from a nation to the world, because humans are everywhere, basically. So that matters. One of the other things which this approach kind of takes, the non-traditional approach takes a different kind of perspective, is The traditional approach focuses on like violence, like physical violence or direct violence, where war comes in. The non-traditional says, well, actually, it's not just about the need, like looking at war, it's more than that. You have to it's also looking into the fear of each individuals. Again, to clarify this, and also this kind of contextualizes the concept of human security, is there has been so much focus on this on the military side of things, but the non-traditional says, take a step back, look at the bigger picture. It's not just about the military, it's also about the economics, it's about the economic, it's about the society in general, it's about the laws, the social aspect, the legal aspect of things. So if you don't change, for instance, something in social and society, for example, it might have an impact on the military stand or the safety of individuals in general. So it looks at an interdependent way of looking at international security. So having this in mind, I was contemplating how I can fit Afghanistan in this idea, where does Afghanistan comes in. But before bringing Afghanistan into this, I looked at some historical accounts, why Afghanistan is important in the first place. I'm sure Moheb will go through the history and he will touch upon some points, but just briefly, throughout the process, when I was looking at the history of Afghanistan, Afghanistan has been used as a buffer state in different eras throughout history to fight proxy wars. But then it has been left. Once either it's a failure or a victory, once that purpose is served, they leave, and they leave Afghanistan in an even worse situation than it was before. And that situation not just hurts Afghans in that place. For example, if we look at the emergence of the Taliban, it was in 1990s, even back, and that was as a result of these proxy wars. The vacuums were left. So what I'm trying to do is, I'm looking at the history, and I'm trying to see if history can be used to help or bring some awareness at the international level, not to do the same, not to repeat the same mistake again. And then also I was looking at some data currently. What has happened is that no matter what, I know these words that I'm going to use is going to be very controversial, like the Taliban's victory. People are very careful when they use the word victory. But here's the thing. It depends on from which angle you're going to watch, look at victory, the word victory in itself. There has been millions of dollars, so many different types of projects in Afghanistan, and then what happened? So that failed. If that failed and they took over, isn't that a type of victory? So, and there's another thing, which I think this is a quote that I'm going to read, and it's going to be a bit longer, but it's very important, because the point I want to make here is kind of bring this awareness how Afghanistan matters to the global security. It's not just about Afghans, it's about the global security, it's about the human security. And also it has challenged, or has been challenging, these ambitions that in the past the empires had ambitions, that somehow in Afghanistan, when they end up in Afghanistan, that gets disrupted. So that disruption happens. For example, Soviet Union. And now one of the authoritative voices about international security, and also especially the US, James F. Jeffrey, was a former ambassador to Iraq and Turkey, and currently is a special envoy to the global coalition to defeat ISIS. Well, this is what he says. This is a failure, first of all. It's the biggest failure that Washington has seen since Vietnam. Secondly, it's not unlike Vietnam, and unlike the half or 1/3 or 2/3 failure of Iraq. This is not just a failure of the United States. It's a failure of the West, because Europe was at least as committed, in some respects, more committed to what we are trying to do in Afghanistan. And up until the end, had a very big role in how we go about doing it. Now, this is very important for the entire world. What I'm going to say will be controversial, but I spent my whole lifetime seeing this in operation, and I believe it's true. Since World War II, that's almost 80 years ago, the major and primary fact of international life has been a global system whose core is global collective security, run by the United States with close and intimate support by Western Europe and other levels of support by Eastern Asia and other countries. That system took blow with Afghanistan, and we all have to deal with it because almost everybody is in the system. Or in the case of China and Russia attempting to work around outside, they're undermining the system. But the system is a primordial issue in international relations. But Afghanistan is not just that. Another thing which was brought into my attention looking into the existing data was that the Afghanistan crisis brought the US and the EU relationship under close scrutiny. And there are voices emanating, echoing from Europe that they want to have a more independent Europe, which is also taking kind of a more traditional look into the international security. And even within the Europe, it's not just Europe as a European Union, it's the countries, the members of the EU, but also like thinking to have a more nationalistic and independent defense policies because of this crisis which happened in Afghanistan. But again, I'm seeing this, and this is going to be tentative, and somehow this what I'm going to say is also informed by my prior research, is having a militaristic thinking is not the answer, and having national interest at the core or at the heart of every policy perspective is also not the answer. There has to be a move from realistic thinking and militaristic thinking. And also this space being so much confined within the statesmen and diplomats and generals, it has to be expanded. And what do I mean by expansion is, for example, the roles of NGO and civil society. And there has been cases, for example, the Convention on Ottawa about the landmines, where the force and the significance of civil society came to the fore, and that was a challenge to the very conventional way of doing things. Dialogue and engagement has to be encouraged. We have to have more dialogue. And I'm going to leave this here. I'm sure you will have questions about how we are going to kind of put practical tools in place in encouraging and making those dialogues happen. But I'll just leave it at this point. This is my thinking, and I'm hoping I can learn from you or your questions. But yeah, I'm just going to leave it here. And thank you.
Thank you very much, Zulfia, for this rich presentation. I think there's a lot of questions I already have, but we will leave them for the end. And for the public, I think it's very interesting to pursue also more in the other presentations, some of the questions, notably on dialogue, engagement. I allow myself this one remark is that dialogue engagement also is something that has been tried before in Afghanistan. So I think one of the questions we can explore maybe is to see, okay, what needs to be done different in this sphere than has been done until now. But I will stop here and hand over to Dr. Haqmal Daudzai for the next presentation with the title, Why Did the US Fail in Afghanistan?
First of all, thank you very much, Dr. Miszak, for the introduction. Dear colleagues, dear friends, and I also like to thank the swisspeace Institute for providing this opportunity and bringing us together. I want to say that I'm also grateful that I'm seeing my colleagues after 7 years or 8 years the first time. Because we are all studied in the same university and now living in different continents. So this is also a very nice atmosphere to be back with my colleagues. So thank you again for providing this opportunity. My name is, as you just said, Haqmal Daudzai. I was also born in Afghanistan. I was 7 when I left Kabul due to civil war. to Pakistan, stayed until the collapse of the Taliban regime, and returned back to Kabul. Did my bachelor degree in Kabul University, and in 2008, I left Afghanistan for the first time and came to Germany. Then returned back and did some development work with the Afghanistan Parliament. And in 2011, I came to Germany permanently because I came for a master's degree and then Ph.D. and now I have my family and living in Frankfurt. So this is to me. And now coming back to the topic, well, when the Taliban took over Afghanistan on 15th of August, we all had one question in mind. What happened? What went wrong? So this question was keeping me very busy. And so though I did my PhD in state building in Afghanistan, so I came up with this idea of what is, from my perspective, someone who has Afghan roots and regularly traveling to Afghanistan, brought me to this question, what went wrong? And I think everybody was faced with this question, what happened? So I'm trying to present my perspective of what went wrong in Afghanistan, why the US and its NATO ally failed in Afghanistan. The 20 years intervention of the United States plus NATO, the $2.3 trillion investment, 243,000 people's life cost, human cost, 5.9 million refugees internally and externally. We have to ask, beside all these investment and losses that we had, what happened? So the answer to this is, we have to start from 2001. When the US intervened in Afghanistan, the primary objective was, as our colleague mentioned, was self-security, to hunt Al-Qaeda in Afghanistan, the war against terror. But as soon as the US entered Kabul, or their troops arrived to Kabul, they realized that yes, there was an entrance, but the exit is really difficult. Because they faced a failed state, and if they could have lived on that time, it could have been ended to another bloody civil war. This is the justification, at least what we could give. But did the US and the Western allies had a plan? No. There was no plan, no intention for peace and security in Afghanistan. The primary goal was to just hunt and kill or capture Al-Qaeda, the leader of Al-Qaeda, Osama bin Laden. So what happened, what they did, and I call this, I would say this 20 years of engagement in Afghanistan, of course, had positive impacts, which we could just give one example, that today we are here. This is the result of the US intervention, that we could speak for Afghanistan here. But there are so many flaws that have been not touched upon, and I'm trying to mention these one by one. The first one, there was no strategy and plan for peace and state building in Afghanistan. The first ad hoc committee, the Bonn Conference, so-called Bonn Conference, was a nation-building attempt. So they bypassed peace building, in which they ignored one of the main conflict party, namely Taliban today. On that time, they did not invite them to the Bonn Conference. They invited only one part of the conflict, in the Northern Alliances. And I know the question would be raised, how could they invite a terrorist organization which at the time raised. But 20 years later, they sit together with all these losses and costs that I mentioned. They sit and made a peace deal in Doha with this terrorist organization. The second flaw was that Afghanistan is a multi-ethnic, multicultural, multi-religious society. So without taking the indigenous culture, understanding the history, they imposed a Western-style democracy, a strong presidential system by theory, and a very bizarre ethno-political elite warlord state system de facto, where the head was a Pashtun and the vice presidents were Tajik, Uzbek, and the provinces were divided to all warlords and elites. So that also drove to the second factor which why Afghanistan failed was the corruption. And they not only excluded Taliban, but they also hit them hard in the field. Not only those who were Taliban, but also those who looked like them. So this is another so-called collateral damage in southern and eastern Afghanistan when they did the drone attacks, research. This also created or paved the way for the re-emergence of Taliban following 2001. And the fourth important factor that the US failed in that was ignoring its regional players, global players and regional players in the context of Afghanistan. In 2001, the US intervened in Afghanistan. There was a common consensus that yes, we have to intervene in Afghanistan, including Russia, including Iran, including China. They not only supported this idea, but they also provided intelligence information in Central Asia countries, which are under the direct influence of Russia. They provided military bases from where they could flew into Afghanistan. But that international consensus and regional consensus fade away as soon as the US intention was announced that they would not go from Afghanistan, that they would create permanent military bases. And that was another factor which the US ignored. And they knew that the regional countries, including Russia, Iran, and China, would not be happy with this. And they did what they could do to support the Taliban military-wise and financially, including Pakistan. We have to also mention this. Well, so these were the factors. The status quo is, I'm not going to talk about the history now. We will leave that to history, but I think the history is repeating itself. It's very interesting to see 20 years have gone. Now we are in a stage where Taliban are back in power. Nobody could have imagined that, but they are now back in Kabul. I just came back a week ago from Kabul. They're back there. So everything is multiplied to zero. You're back there where we were. Women could not go to school. They are banned from work. I'm working with an organization in Afghanistan. It's a German-based organization. We have 365 colleagues. We have 75 colleagues in Kabul office. Among them are 2 females. So minority rights are at risk. The Taliban current government I'm a Pashtun, but I want to say this. The current Taliban government is a pure Pashtun-dominated regime based on religious ideology. As I said, minorities' rights are violated, human rights are violated. there is no free speech, no free media. So the question is, should we leave Afghanistan here? Because I say the history is repeating itself. Taliban agreed to all these conditions in February 2020 when President Trump made a deal with them. They said, well, we agree to all these conditions, including disengaging with the international terrorist organization, including Al-Qaeda. Respecting human rights, free speech, media, democracy. These were all agreed at the Doha conference, Doha agreement. Now, the question is, again, I'm discussing this because I'm facing, my audience are more Europeans and Westerns, so that's why I'm bringing back the topic here, because we started from the point where we've gone 20 years of all these efforts, and we were standing back there, where there is again a need, and this is now the question, to go back there, to start yet another intervention, military. And that's the question, what's the way forward? And I think that's also the title of today's conference. If we leave Taliban with this status, should we leave them? Is there a guarantee that it would be not another safe haven for the international tourists, where the Europe and Western interest would be in danger? Should we engage with a terrorist organization? These are all questions that we all have, but it's really difficult to answer. I could just conclude it with this, that yes, we have to engage with the Taliban, because we started it. We hand them over everything. By we, I mean, yes, it's an Afghan flaws at the first hand, but on the other hand, international community, leading by the United States plus the NATO, they're all responsible for this. So I would just propose that in order to change the current crisis, or to at least bring a different atmosphere than the one which we are having, and it's getting toward it, getting worse and worse, we have to stay engaged with the Taliban and create an atmosphere where the international community, together with regional countries, make a consensus in which they agree upon human rights, women's rights, an inclusive Afghan government. If these are the conditions for the engagement with the Taliban, I'm hopeful that there will be some changes. Otherwise, if we repeat, as I said, the history, was it happened in 2003 when the US intervened in Afghanistan, the war in Iraq happened after 2 years, and the whole focus and resources went to Iraq, and they ignore Afghanistan, which is happening, unfortunately, again the same, or is somehow relatively. Now, the whole focus is to Ukraine, which I totally understand. That's true. It's a war in Europe's drone. It's a Europe war, and the Europe and the US must engage, but they have to take in mind that they should not forget Afghanistan, because that was the place where they were for 20 years, and I'm not sure if they forget Afghanistan that they would not go back again, because I've been there and I've seen everything with my own eyes. So Yeah, I will just conclude it here. I will just keep this question, just put this as a question in the store, that how should we engage with the Taliban? What do you think? Should we engage, should we not engage? Thank you very much.
Thank you, Haqmal, for this presentation. I think it ties in nicely. You pick up a few points that were already started on. I think the question, which is of course emerging, okay, why should Afghanistan matter to the West? Should we just leave Afghanistan? What are the dilemmas that actually we're confronted? We have to engage, is your suggestion. How exactly we can still, I think, discuss, or if there are other options as well. But I think, again, this is one of the things which is emerging as an essential point in how to move forward in Afghanistan. With this, I will hand over to Bilquees Daud for the next presentation called Radicalization in Afghanistan, Counter Discourses Through Peace Education.
Thank you so much, and thanks everyone for listening. Special thanks to Farooq for making this happen, and speech, of course, to bring all of us together in order to share our point of views. Well, I think Haqmal's, before my presentation, I have to introduce myself. I'm Bilquees Daud. Before my presentation, I have to introduce myself. I'm Bilquees Daud. I'm from Afghanistan. I was also born in Afghanistan, but then my family had to migrate to Pakistan because of civil war. So I spent 10 years in Pakistan and in refugee camps. And then post-2001 development, we went back to Afghanistan, and then I started my education, and I did my DA from the American University of Afghanistan in social sciences. I started working in different NGOs in Afghanistan, and then I got a scholarship and went to Germany for my MA degree. And then I also worked in that university for 1 year as a research assistant. And now I'm in India and teaching in a private university as an assistant professor. And there, the name of university is Jindal Global University, and we have a Center for Afghanistan Studies. And we have also been engaged with Afghanistan very closely. So that's it about me. And, I think Haqmal's speech was a very good transition to what I'm going to say, for two reasons. First, violence and Pashtun, right? I usually, whenever even before I do my BA, I was very interested, and at the same time, very saddened to hear that, certain ethnicity have been always associated with violence, right? And there has been lots of misrepresentation of Afghanistan through media. As we all know, that media gives also false information, right? So I come from southeast of Afghanistan, from Paktika, which is one of the most insecure and so-called dangerous place, right? And I have never been to Paktika. And I come from a village that we don't have a school for girls. So that won't be wrong if I say that I'm the only female from my village was done an MA degree and was teaching. But my family always had a very close relation with the village, And my both parents, they would tell the stories of the village, how the village life was before all era of radicalization, right? But when after 2001, especially, I always could hear people would ask me, "You're a Pashtun? I'm also a Pashtun. I don't want to bring ethnicity here because I believe in multi-ethnic Afghanistan. I think our beauty is in diversity. And in my family, we have people from all ethnic groups, Tajiks, Hazaras, from everywhere, right? But I'm making the point because I was always being asked that, oh, you're a Pashtun? Okay, but then you must be very conservative. Then you must be supporting Taliban, So that really made me interested to do research and to study why Afghanistan became so radicalized. Especially not only for a non-Afghan audience, but also for some of the new generation of Afghanistan. They don't know that Afghanistan was not always like this. Like the whole idea of radicalization actually took place mostly after the jihad period. My family tells me the story of the village that in Sharauda village in Paktika, women would go to water stream and would bring water. They would be dancing in the wedding ceremonies with men. And of course, they would strictly follow the Pashtun code. But one of the components of the Pashtun code is that even the milmastia, right, the hospitality, that even if a woman is all alone at home and a stranger man knocks and asks for shelter, that woman is obliged to open the door, to give that man food and to welcome him to home. So that's in total contradiction to what we see in today's Afghanistan, right? And so that's why I wanted to study that from where radicalization started. And then I will go back to nonviolence and how do we correct it. And you know, I'm going beyond 2001. And if you see Afghanistan, of course, before 19th century, Afghanistan was always, you know, a place of great civilization. We had great scholars emerged, right? But then, you know, the major educational reform started with the King Aman Allah Khan in 1919. He was the very revolutionary king who gave equal rights to women, who sent a lot of women for, you know, studying abroad. Of course, his reform was too harsh for a society like Afghanistan, but he paid special attention to education, right? I'm going to, you know, like be fast on the history part because I want to focus more on the recommendation part. And then, you know, the main thing here is that Afghanistan, each regime change was accompanied by a curriculum change. Why? Because education is the best tool to indoctrinate the young generation, right? So each regime has changed the curriculum according to their political agendas, right? And the other thing is that Afghanistan education system has always depended on different donors. Before it was Germany, France, right? And then Russians, and then of course all other players like Pakistan, Saudi. So that actually impacted education system to serve the agenda of different donor agencies. So that created lots of, you know, curriculum change. But two major, you know, eras impacted education system in Afghanistan very negatively. First one is Sovietization, right? And we all know that the Soviet education system, they focus more on orphans, because orphans they lack parental care, and I think they will be deteriorated, you know, better. So that's why they focus on orphans. And but at the same time that they change the curriculum according to the you know, to their propaganda, they also provided literacy training and literacy program for people who are out of school. Right, so there is lots of you know, impact. The Sovietization impacted the curriculum also negatively, but the thing was that they also paid special attention to women. So that's why, beside all the criticism of Soviets, that era in Afghanistan is still considered a golden era for women, because figures says that, you know, 70% of civil servants in education ministry were women, 50% of teachers were women, right? So that, but that era was the Soviets, they wanted the education system to be in a way that the young generation is or total alien with their history, right? So the Russian language became mandatory, and there was, you know, scholarships were given to young students to go to Russia and study there, right? But the most importantly, the era that impacted the education system negatively is Islamization. What do I mean by Islamization? The moment Soviets occupied Afghanistan, the jihad period started, right? People who did jihad, they migrated to Iran and Pakistan. They created different political parties, right? And those parties were directly funded by the West. And of course, it's supported by Pakistan and by Saudi. So what happened there? People were out of school, the refugees, they couldn't afford to go to Pakistani schools, right? So there was in refugee camps, and in refugee camps, there were schools made by different NGOs. And, you know, both in madrasas and also beside madrasas, there were also schools that were made by different NGOs, and that schooling was free of cost. So for refugees who went there, for them, this was the best arrangement, right? But if you see the picture, that really challenged me to see it even now. See the kind of curriculum that was used in the refugee camp schooling. You know, you see the girl is taking a book, and her book is different from the boy's book. Why? Because again, they focus more on young boys. They wanted those young boys to be more violent and to take part in jihad. And that really, impacted the next generation of Afghanistan negatively. Because a generation, just imagine a guy who was only maybe 5 years old and went to a refugee camp, and he has been, studying in this kind of school, and now he's an adult, right? So how do we expect him to be nonviolent? So, the Afghan school books add the images of violence, guns, and, and those, interesting thing is that those books were funded by the Americans, by the USA, printed in the University of Nebraska, because they wanted to promote anti-Soviet propaganda, right? And furthermore, see the way they were teaching maths to young children. That's it. Okay. You want to say something? Okay. So, for example, you have 5 guns, and if I give you 5 more, how much it will be? So this is the way that they were teaching mathematics to young children, right? So these kind of, that was the era that really radicalized the young mind in Afghanistan. That is the era that radicalization has started, right? So, they focused more on orphans, because orphans, they had no parents, right? And they would be in madrasas, and madrasas, they would be given free lodging and free, food. So they would be indoctrinated with this kind of education system. And those were most of them were the boys who later on did the suicide attacks in Afghanistan. So, education system has really damaged the, social fabric of Afghanistan. Post-2001 development, I'm not going to talk about it more because my colleague already talked about it. Post-2001, many Afghans were really hopeful, and if you see the figures, the enrollment increased, and majority of the teachers were female, and 38% of students were female, right? And the new constitution gave, provided gender equality and access to free education for both genders. So you see that there is lots of achievements that we have after 2001. Of course, there are also challenges, right? But the new curriculum that was designed in 2001, the Ministry of Education on that time claimed that it had the human rights issues. But again, there were 2 criticisms of that curriculum according to my research. The first criticism is that when they were talking about minorities, they only talked about ethnic minorities. They totally ignored the religious minorities. In Afghanistan, we also have religious minorities. For example, in that curriculum, we have religious teachings and we had general teachings. So the only point that religious minorities were mentioned was that they should not be sitting in the religious class, because they were mostly non-Muslims, right? And that curriculum also, they tried to incorporate peace education, but there were lots of challenges for the government of that time, because they didn't have enough teachers who were trained in peace education. But still, that curriculum was much better than what we had before, right? So if you see the different curriculum system, right? Usually violence has been, young children has been brainwashed, and they have been always taught to do political struggle in a violent way, right? While non-violence is also a very important tool to protest against the injustices, right? And Taliban today, we all know what is going on in the country, right? Girls above grade 6 are not allowed to go to school. And Taliban, they have very mixed priorities. On one hand, they don't allow girls to go to school. The excuses are made that they don't have proper resources and the situation is not ready for them to go. On the other hand, they are opening 10 madrasas in each district. So see, the education system is again being used the same way as it has always been, right? And a few days before, the Minister of Education of Taliban, he declared the Western sciences and education, to be totally, abolished from the new curriculum, right? So in one hand, the worry is that girls are not allowed to go to school. But the major worry is that even if they are allowed, what will be the curriculum? Because Taliban will really try to change the curriculum and go back to the same, curriculum that was used by Americans to provoke anti-Soviet sentiments, right? And also Taliban, another thing that they do, that they really target professors and education institutions that are against their ideology. And that is, evidenced by firing of 50 professors from University of Balkh, right? And also they suspended the activities of prestigious Pachahan Institute in Kandahar University. So they really don't want the, liberal education to be part of a new curriculum, right? So when I talk about this whole education system and how people have been encouraged to do violence, the solution that I propose is that in Afghanistan, because education plays a very important role, and in Afghanistan, we see that number-wise, we have mostly most of the population are young and above 25 age. So the education system can play a very important role in restoring the social fabric of our modern society, right? And education system, when we want to talk about the theories of nonviolence, we really have to, incorporate the theories of nonviolence that is familiar for the, that region. So we don't have to bring a copy-paste module of the West and implement it in Afghanistan. So that's why I always believe that we have to work with the social realities. So the whole radicalization happened because of the politicization of Islam, right? We have always been asked why Islam encourages violence, right? So actually the Islamic teaching, Islamic text has been misinterpreted by the radical Islamists or by Wahhabis. For example, the whole idea of holy war on jihad. It has been, misinterpreted that you have to do jihad against non-Muslims, right? While if you see the text here, Islam doesn't say this, If you see Islam from a non-violence, point of view, Islam actually encourages greater jihad, jihad al-akbar, which is jihad with inner self. You have to reform yourself prior doing jihad, doing military jihad, right? So that military jihad is actually not giving that much importance as the greater jihad. But if you see the interpretation of Islamic text has been in a way that they say the other way around, right? And also, if you see in Islam, we also have a very important, verses. They say that there is no compulsion in religion. Your religion for you, my religion for me. But that part has never been, brought to public's attention, because the overall political agenda behind the politicization of the religion was that they wanted to achieve their own political ends, right? And the overall, the process of radicalization through Wahhabi madrasas has really impacted the Afghanistan society. So talking about why certain ethnicity has been, associated with violence, right? But, people forget that we also had figures like Khan Abdul Ghaffar Khan. Khan Abdul Ghaffar Khan was the first Muslim and Pashtun non-violent leader. Of course, his legacy is controversial in a sense that he doesn't belong to any country, but he belongs to a region, because he was born in British India, he lived in Pakistan, and he's buried in Afghanistan. So he was a close companion of Gandhi. He fought for India's independence, right? And he also, his legacy is important. Why? Because his legacy is, in accordance to the social context. First, he used Islam. He introduced the non-violent way of Islam to bring awareness to people, because at that time Britishers would not allow villagers to go to school, right? But Pacha Khan's main strategy was to establish schools in different villages, and he always encouraged women, young girls, to go to school, especially because he believed that if a woman is educated, the whole family will be educated, right? And he also established grassroots level movement, Khudai Khidmatgars, right, or servants of gods. And there he did not only include Pashtuns or Muslims, but he also includes Hindus and Sikhs. Because Pacha Khan always believed in a peaceful coexistence of multi-religious groups in society. So if we have figures of like Pacha Khan, right, and if we see that he has done great work in the education system, we better incorporate his theories in the education system in Afghanistan in order for young generation to learn that violence is not the only way for a political or social change. You can also adapt non-violence way of political change, right? And Jabarkhail, maybe he was not aware of the term peace education, but he was already using it, right? Because the term peace education was introduced later on by the United Nations. United Nations actually named the decade of 2001 to 2010 as a decade of peace and non-violence. So that's how they came up with the term peace education. So peace education has been used in different war zone societies, and peace education has been tested with the societies that are suffering from ethnic and religious divisions, and it has been described as a valuable tool for bringing, coexistence and tolerance in society. And that theory, I believe, we can use this concept in an education system of Afghanistan. How? I propose these tools for peace education. Language of peace. What happened in Afghanistan that whenever we talk or whenever we, teach history in classrooms, we don't teach them in a holistic way. So language of peace means that we have to make sure that the young generation or, young students, they value humanity, humanity as a whole, mankind as a whole, not only a particular religion or particular ethnic group, right? So it can create a peaceful coexistence. And of course, I'm not going to see each of them. You would read it in my paper because I think we're short of time. But there are different other tools that how do you make sure that students are the center of focus? How do you make sure that you teach history in a way that you focus more like figures like Jabarkhail, right? So you teach them that Islam doesn't say that you have to fight. Islam doesn't say that you only have to do jihad in a military way, right? So we have to teach them the non-violence techniques, the peace education techniques, and most importantly, from the classroom, you have to encourage women participation, right? Because that is a mini society where students learn how to respect different genders. So from there, you have to make sure that young girls are part of each activity. And the policy recommendation that I have for the current scenario, how do we engage with Taliban, right? Unfortunately, it's a fact that they are in power, right? And we can't deal with them. So some policy recommendations that I came up with is that international community, they should use their diplomatic and economic, leverages with Taliban to ensure that they have, inclusive learning spaces and the peace education component is sustained, right? And the other thing is that the international community can really build bridges between the civil society and local actors and the local level, because even if we come up with an inclusive peace education strategy, but how do we make sure that that is implemented in different districts, different villages? So that can be done by the local actors like shoras, like jirgas, right? And the most important thing is that we have to really work with the mullahs, ulamas, because they have a social capital, they can influence Taliban, right? And the other thing is that we have to make sure that the Islamic countries, they come up with a non-violent interpretation of Islamic teaching, because they also can influence Taliban better than any other country. So these are the things that can be done to make sure that not only girls are allowed to go to school, but also children in Afghanistan, they have access to a quality education, to education that would not indoctrinate them furthermore with violence. So that's it from me. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Bilquees. I think this is a very important complement, different angle. I think not only to shed light on Afghan history, I think through the education sector, which is very revealing, but also that maybe neglected field of what has been done in the last 20 years also could be one of the failures of the last 20 years as well, is to neglect the education system in Afghanistan. So I think thanks a lot for this intervention. And with this, I would pass to Moheb Jabarkhail for the final talk.
Sure, thank you, Nick. First of all, I would like to again thank swisspeace, Nick, Farouk for providing this platform to us Afghans who are not politicians, but we look at Afghanistan's matter more from both personal as well as academic and scholastic perspectives. It is needed. It's a unique approach that has been missing in dealing with Afghanistan. I was born in the middle of the Cold War in Afghanistan, the Cold War in general, but also in Afghanistan. 2 months old, Soviets bombed out a village in eastern Afghanistan where my family lived. We were fortunate to survive, but some of my relatives were not. And that is the start of my life. As a 2 months old baby, we took refuge in Pakistani camps across the border and lived the life of a refugee, a typical refugee that had many challenges and struggles and insecurities that we see. The Ukraine war is ongoing, but I lived through it. And in there, some of the books that were shown, it reminded me of that time that some of these books were the ones that were taught to us in those refugee schools. And it was a process of, when I reflect back, a process where radicalization was really at that stage. I consider myself a scholar practitioner mostly, and I research human security, economic development matters, governance, good governance matters related to Afghanistan. I collaborated with Dr. Farouk to write the Afghanistan Isolation or Engagement paper that was published in the Journal of Policing and Global Terrorism. I've also written on human security and globalization, UN peacekeeping mission in Afghanistan, and a policy brief, again, in the past for swisspeace as well. As a practitioner, I now work, I live in the US. I live in Washington, close to Washington, DC. I work with an organization called CIPE, Center for International Private Enterprise, where we work for democracy. CIPE works for democracy through support for the private sector and trade. And in the past, I've worked in Afghanistan with NGOs, INGOs, even the government, the Ministry of Finance, Ministry of Agriculture, to facilitate global international aid going to Afghanistan and going into national development projects there. Education-wise, I did a master's with my colleagues at Willy Brandt School of Public Policy in Germany. Before that, I did a BA in economics jointly at Kabul University and then at Bard College in New York. And I'm currently working with George Mason on another master's in global affairs. And it's almost done. So with that personal introduction and kind of insight into Afghanistan matters, I like to give some statistics. Afghanistan is, as my friends also referred to, it's called the heart of Asia. And when the heart has a problem, the body cannot really function. And that has been the story of Afghanistan for the past 40 years, 50 years, most of my life. It's a 652 square kilometer country that is now landlocked, bordering Pakistan, Iran, Uzbekistan, Turkmenistan in the north, and even China in the east, southeast, eastern part. We do most of we did most of our international trade through now to the Karachi port in Pakistan. So there's a dependence on Pakistan, and also through Chabahar in Iran. But Afghanistan historically was not a landlocked country. Modern Afghanistan started in the 18th century, beginning of the 18th century, where couple of dynasties or empires were created. The Hotaki at the beginning of the 18th century that stretched from parts of Iran, some parts of Central Asia, all the way down to parts of Pakistan. So a bigger, and then also the Durrani Empire that followed it and kind of created the basis for what is now Afghanistan. by Ahmad Shah Durrani, was one of the greatest empire in the Islamic world, next to the Ottoman Empire. The West is very much familiar with Ottoman, but on the other side, we have the Durrani Empire that also stretched from almost half of Iran, Isfahan, all the way to New Delhi, parts of Pakistan. A lot of that land was lost due to both internal disagreements. Afghanistan had too many kings and too many leaders that wanted to be kings. But also expansion of the colonial British India on the east, and Czarist Russia, and later on Soviet Union in the north. So coming down, we lost more and more of the land, and now are left with what is Afghanistan. So being at the crossroads of those Central Asian countries, we are also a population that's very diverse. The last census, official census that was done in Afghanistan was said we were about 15 million people in 1980s. Now, estimate says that we are about 40 million people. And that 40 million people are again, multi-ethnic, multilingual, yes, practice mostly Islam. By 2050, it's thought that with the growth rate that is there, we might turn into an 80 million country, a country of 80 million population. So big population in there. Now, the major ethnic groups in Afghanistan are the Pashtuns, who form about 40 to about 50% of the population. Tajiks, about 20 to 30% of the population. The Hazaras, about 10 to 15% of the population. And then we have others, Uzbeks, Turkmens, Baloch. The former constitution of Afghanistan listed about 14 official nationalities, ethnic groups in Afghanistan. 25% or 30% of these people live in urban centers like Kabul, Herat, Kandahar, and about 75% of the population lives in rural Afghanistan. Which are two distinct differences, and this is important to our discussion. We are multilingual. Pashto and Dari, which is an Afghan dialect of the Persian language, Farsi, are our official languages, and then we have additional languages that are spoken Uzbek, Turkmen. But Dari is the inter-ethnic language in Afghanistan. So we converse mostly through Dari as an lingua franca, basically, so among each other. Islam is our religion. 99% of the people in Afghanistan are Muslim, 1% Hindus, Sikhs, and there were some Jews in Afghanistan as well. And within that, then 85% would be Sunni Muslims, and then the other 15 to 20% are Shia Muslims. And with, just to breaking it down is, a lot of the Sunnis include the Pashtuns, the Tajiks, the Uzbeks, the Turkmens, and others. And within the Shia sect, mostly the Hazaras and some minorities in the other ethnic groups are also included. Pre-Islamic religions in Afghanistan were Zoroastrian, Buddhism, influenced by Hinduism, and Judaism as well. Was part of Afghanistan. Now the governments in there, all through the 18th century to now, we are ruled by monarchs. In the first republic, all the way to the middle of the 20th century. So monarchs, emperors that expanded the land, and then kings, so it became a kingdom, up until the middle of the 20th century, and then the 1973, there was a coup d'etat by one of the nephews of the last king, King Zayed, and turned Afghanistan into a republic, and it was the start of the troubles in the country as well. So the republicanism in Afghanistan started with difficulties. Then we had communist rule in post 1973, Soviet involvement in Afghanistan, of course, and then the Islamic State of Afghanistan, the Taliban's first Islamic Emirate, and the contemporary Islamic Republic, and now back to the Islamic State. Democracy in Afghanistan the word democracy might be an alien word, but democracy as a practice is not. Afghanistan, even ruled by monarchs, had jirgas, which means councils, very localized versions of it, both to resolve conflicts, but even to elect leaders. The first king of Afghanistan, Abdurrahman, was elected through a loya jirga, a grand council of the elders. So that practice is not alien to Afghanistan. And since the early 20th centuries, we had parliaments as well. Despite having kings, we had constitutional parliaments. Prime ministers were elected, and the constitution under King Zayed Shah was one of the progressive constitutions that even influenced the new constitution that was developed later on, and even the Taliban in their first rule implemented that constitutional system. I'll talk a little bit about the Taliban later if needed, but I want to come to the Afghan economy. Let me talk about the Taliban. So what is the Taliban basically? It's, an ideology that was created, unfortunately, in the Cold War. The Cold War was meant to stop atheist communism. And in Afghanistan, the Cold War was not a Cold War. It was a hot war. It was a very hot war, and in that sense, the jihad that happened there killed about 1 million Afghans. 1 million Afghans lost their life in that, and imagine the infrastructure and other destruction that happened in there. And most of the current Taliban were maybe the children of those mujahideen that fought in the Soviet war and then continue to either study in the madrasa system, which is a parallel informal educational system in Afghanistan, and in parts of Pakistan, where free education, food, room, and board is given to the very poor kids. And that radicalization process also, unfortunately, happens there. So the Afghan economy, it was a traditional economy. It became a centralized economy, central planning economy, and then went into a free market economy. And the sectors that were very active or includes Afghanistan's GDP were agriculture, industry, and the services. So 20% agriculture, 25 industries, about other 20 to 25%, and then a lot of the services in contemporary Afghanistan. And it expanded in the failure. We talk about failure in Afghanistan, but as a result of foreign aid, it expanded 20 to 30% sometime in the past 20 years. So some good indicators there. Now the GDP is about, it was in 20 billion. The economy has contracted by 5%. So it's in minus, in contraction right now. And the per capita income in Afghanistan is like $500 per person. Unemployment has significantly worsened. 40% of the Afghan labor is in the economy, in the labor economy. And of that 40%, 13 to 15 or 20% are now unemployed. So unemployment is a huge problem. Now, human insecurity, which is something I want to discuss, is basically is a result of many things there, but it's very bad. It's very worse. Afghanistan is one of the worst countries for a human in terms of many of the securities that we consider. And this is non-traditional way of looking at it, not just physical security by the existence of war, but human security encompasses is economic traits, jobs, freedom, state repression. All of those have returned into Afghanistan and threatening people. About 60% of Afghanistan are threatened to live in poverty. It's under the 1 point or the $2 World Bank ratio. Global crisis, COVID also impacts Afghanistan, and climate change has been really affecting Afghanistan in the past few years as well. The causes of the human insecurity, if I can quickly run them and we can discuss this more, is failure of the post 9/11 Afghan institutions and leadership in particular, in both selectively managing its foreign policy towards its neighbors regionally and others. whether it was because of them or the engagement, but their failure both on the foreign policy front, but then also domestically in domestic policy in failing to create sufficient cohesion and institutional development was one cause. Second, my friends talked about it, was very militaristic approach to resolving Afghanistan's problems. The war machine was much stronger than the development machine in Afghanistan. $1 trillion were spent on fighting and war in Afghanistan, while like a few billions were spent here and there on development. The Doha and the Bonn processes, they were very excluding processes. In Doha, the whole discussion and communication was with the Taliban, and the Bonn it excluded the Taliban and other Afghan functions such as Hizb Islami, which were very dominant in the Afghan jihad. They were not considered isolated from the process. And in the whole Doha process, however, it was only with the Taliban, the Afghan government, and to some extent, I would argue, European partners were passive watchers of what was going on between the West, the US, and Taliban. And now civilian disengagement in Afghanistan and a de facto sanctioning of Afghanistan. The country is not under any sanctions, but in practice, that's what has happened. The whole country has been sanctioned, and that is a cause of a lot of human insecurity. And of course, the diverted Western attention and interest in Afghanistan to other matters. There are some policy recommendations that I can talk about very quickly. So first of all, considering all of these matters, I think there needs to be a proactive Western involvement in Afghanistan, not a passive watch and see what happens approach. And what that means is, I think there needs to be an in-country presence for Western diplomatic missions, even if it's like print, but there is infrastructure. A lot of Western countries had embassies, functioning embassies, and infrastructures that are there. Security for these institutions is sort of guarantees. The UN is there, so all of these institutions can also be there, and they should protect Afghans at risk, provide them with opportunities for those Afghans that need to leave. If that's an international requirement, if they need to leave, I think they should provide that support, and then have an in-country dialogue with the de facto authority in Afghanistan. The UN calls the Taliban authority a de facto authority in Afghanistan, but also the Afghan civil society in-country. That is very essential, and that dialogue should encompass some of the matters that we discussed, whether those are women's rights and human rights or governance system in Afghanistan. And then I think these West should also engage with Afghans here in the West to inform that dialogue that's happening in country. But the main focus should be the in-country discussion. The Doha process should be replaced by a Kabul process, and that should happen in country. There are precedents for this. The joint monitoring, GCMB, Joint Commission for Monitoring, I think, or board was one institution where Westerners in Afghanistan and the previous Afghan government would sit together and monitor what was going on and discuss policies. Unfreeze Afghanistan's reserves. 9 billion of Afghan reserves are in Western countries, 7 billion in the US, about 2 billion in Switzerland, Germany, the UK, and UAE. So that needs to happen. And then on there is a humanitarian crisis. We need a humanitarian trust fund to deal with people that are hungry. Famine is threatening people. Overall, in all these 20 years, there was no development plan for Afghanistan. Post-World War II, there was a Marshall Plan that helped enable economies here. There needs to be a Marshall Plan for Afghanistan. It should have been in place in 2001. That didn't happen. It should be in place now to develop Afghanistan's economy and march towards the SDGs. And then finally, there could be a multilateral watchdog established to review both and report on compliance of global security concerns in Afghanistan, but also on Western's non-military involvement in Afghanistan, and also Afghanistan's neighbors' involvement in Afghanistan's affairs. That would be an important, I think it is an important need because Afghanistan's affairs have been impacted here. I will stop here and then open it up for questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Moheb, and thanks to, again, all the panelists for your contributions. With this, finally, I would like to open up the discussion and come to you and see if there's any questions starting here in the room. So we have a first right of on-site participants. So please, if you have any questions. Is that a yes? Okay, so please.
Questions. So, first of all, thanks to all the panelists for the interesting presentation. I think I have basically two core questions. One of them is, what does engagement with the Taliban mean? Should the Taliban be recognized? I think this is a bit the elephant in the room, because we can say we want to dialogue with the Taliban, but then the question is under what condition exactly? Do you think Western governments should recognize them as the jure government of Afghanistan, yes or no? And then related to that, because there was talk about using diplomatic and financial leverage on the Taliban regime. But my question is, like, is there enough domestic pressure within Afghanistan to hold the Taliban to account? Like, what is there a true civil society? And I don't mean like a foreign-sponsored civil society that we saw the past 20 years, but what civil society is there at the moment that can really push them to allow for this type of dialogue? Yeah, maybe to start with that.
Thanks for the questions. I think I would actually like brief responses from all of you so that you can all have something to say on the matters. Maybe we start this time.
Thank you very much. I think it's an interesting question. Yes, the West should engage with Taliban. They were engaged with them. They were in Afghanistan. The West was there when the Taliban were there. So they were engaged in Doha. And our appeal is that they should not disengage now. Since they were engaged, they should continue this engagement and complete, as our colleague says, the Doha agreement. Because this is what we Afghans agreed to it. Making peace does not mean making peace only with the US, but making peace with the Afghans. So that's what we mean by engagement. Whatever leverages they used before are still in hand that they could use it. Because we know Taliban knew how to fight, but they don't know how to govern. They don't have any financial means. I would say not enough. They have enough, but they don't have as much as to lead a country. So they should not be recognized until and unless the human rights, minority rights, women rights, and inclusive Afghan government. These were all conditions that were put in place when the Doha Agreement started. These were basically the articles that were discussed there. And that is our, as Afghan, we insist still on that deal. Now, just to touch upon the second question, yes, there is an Afghan society. If we say what we have achieved during the past 20 years in Afghanistan, the only thing we have achieved is that we have a young, active civil society. They are fighting still. They are not sponsored by any international organization. They are women, they are girls going beside all these threats to the streets. They are protesting. They are not obeying whatever the Taliban says. Most of them have been captured and still in prison. They have been beaten. They are still being beaten every day. But this movement is still there. And their voice is now the Taliban are trying to suppress the media, that if anybody covers such events, they will be put in prison. But beside all these threats, civil society is still there. It may be in a small number, but it's still there. And that's what we can say, what we have achieved in the past 20 years, which we didn't have before. This is from myself.
Maybe on this side of the panel instead.
Yes, yeah. Especially on the second question, because that was the recommendation that came from my slide. Yeah, actually, you know, they, as Haqmal said, that we have civil society in Afghanistan, and we also have civil society in exile. Because unfortunately, many activists, they had to leave Afghanistan, right? So one of the recommendations that actually I couldn't say due to the shortage of time is that West has to engage with the Afghan civil society in exile, and maybe for time being, because providing education for girls especially is not possible physically in Afghanistan, but they can do it through online platforms, through online academies, through online institutions. But even there, the focus should be on the inclusive peace education, right? So we have civil society in Afghanistan and in exile. And as Haqmal said, you might have seen that women are the first to work with the Taliban. So there is enough, you know, kind of opposition to Taliban in Afghanistan because of their strategies, right? And the first question, I think West is already engaged with Taliban, right? Taliban were here in Norway a few days back, right? They have decided to be engaged. So, but it's better that that engagement be in a way that it benefits Afghanistan, right? And unfortunately, the war that has been fought in Afghanistan, it was never our war. It was others' war, but we fought it. It was at our cost, right? So that's why that engagement, when the Doha talk was also taking place, actually, the overall, the way Taliban took power was not right, right? They came as, they always use victory, right? They didn't come as a power sharing government. So that way, that would have been easier for the West to, you know, to be engaged. But I think even the West decided to give Afghanistan in the platter to the Taliban.
Can I just say something? I think this is really important to understand the on-the-ground reality. What constitutes Afghanistan and this entire state building? I came across this data where it said, and it was a very interesting thing, which also changed my perception of Afghanistan, is that the state building in Afghanistan has been contained in the center. There's this limited process happening there. We have a constitution. Does it get implemented? No. How the constitution, like I'm speaking about the pre-Taliban constitution, how was it implemented? No. How did it came into being? Again, the process was so limited and confined. Of course, a constitution should be as a result of mobilizing people, right? The same thing with laws and some. I was advisor to the first vice president during the Karzai regime, working with the UNDP project. With their policymaking is so confined, and of course, the donor funded. It never actually, this process never actually gets diffused across the society. Now, this leaves me. What is Afghanistan? And there was another really interesting point. And they said, the US came to Afghanistan and they left. Many people, majority in the periphery, they were not even affected. Regime change, Taliban takeover, and still they haven't been affected. They have those village lives, they just continue. And that's something which made me think about this question, how people get to know something. For example, in the West, many of my knowledge information is not a good thing. I get it from social media. And this entire, even the TikTok thing, some of the news, I just look at it, it's so brief. And then I was thinking, does it happen in Afghanistan? Do we even have radios and TVs across different peripheries in Afghanistan? And sometimes the answer is no. So what I propose here is understanding the reality of Afghanistan is really important. And that takes me to the next point, is the mobilization of people. That has to happen. Again, engagement with the Taliban. What does that entail? Where does Afghan people? Sometimes, if I look at the Kabul, the regime changes. Yes, in some places, they are the ones who are paying. Afghan people are the ones who are paying. The leadership, they left. They are having really luxurious life. I don't know what they're doing now. They left. But who are they? Who are paying for this? It's the Afghan people. So if any type of engagement happens, we have to make sure, and I know I'm very confused with the word we. Sometimes I represent Western society. By we, I mean West, and sometimes I mean Afghanistan. But in this context, when I'm saying we as West, we have to make sure that the people gets engaged in the process. this is going to be a very long process, but this acknowledgement needs to be done at some point. And just one last thing is how engagement has to happen. Again, this is from the past 20 years. Engagement in Afghanistan was one way and very limited. Engagement means you're bringing somebody on the table, you're making them feel as part of the process, you're listening to their experiences, and that's where you come up with a policy recommendation, that's when you come up with the law, because you listen to the people, you identify their needs, and you also make them feel part of the process. This authentic process never happened, this engaging never happened in Afghanistan, be it in terms of women or anybody else. Women were considered as objects throughout this process. I looked in as part of my PhD and I was shocked. I was like, no, actually, they are not objects. They have agency, as much agency as any other individual human being. Yes, they have to be empowered to exercise their agency.
So maybe this is a good lead over to a question in the chat, or several questions actually, which go in a similar direction in the sense of, I mean, one of the questions is, you spoke a lot about Afghanistan being used somehow. I mean, there was different phrases used, proxy wars, it is not our war, etc. But the question, or it's more the comment in the sense, is that Afghanistan is abused internally also, as well as externally. I think the second question, or that I might add here, is that it goes back to the larger question we had in the beginning of why should one stay engaged in Afghanistan, or why should, especially the West. So why the US or the EU is deemed responsible to bring about now a change in Afghanistan. Maybe also we've seen that in the last 20 years it didn't work so well. Or in another way of putting it from the Zoom is that, is there actually a cost to the West if it disengages from Afghanistan? And I think this will be also one of the questions or ways in which policymakers here put it. So is there a cost if the West disengages from Afghanistan? Is there really a cost for the West? I'm not talking about Afghans here in the question.
Yeah, I can start with that. First of all, Afghanistan is a Western liability. A liability looked at post-Cold War. We Afghans fought the Soviets, the communist Soviet, with Stinger missiles that were given to us. A million, as I mentioned earlier, 1 million of Afghans were lost, infrastructure was destroyed, the country was in rubbles. And what happened is the West turned their back on us in the 90s, and that created both the civil war. Afghans at that time knew nothing. They only knew how to use a gun, and they turned it on each other and further destroyed Afghanistan and created the very much scenarios for the emergence of Taliban. So it is a Western liability if we look at that situation. And then post 9/11, you know, Taliban were squished into the camp of Al-Qaeda or a global institution. Taliban, in a sense, yes, they are radicalized and different, but they are an Afghanistan-focused entity. It's not an ethnic movement. There is ethnic domination of the Pashtuns because of the rural Pashtuns bordering Pakistan, and you know, were able to go to Pakistanis and in eastern southern Afghanistan, where there were a lot of madrasas. But what happened is, in a post 9/11 environment, the militaristic approach, the war in Afghanistan, there were 3 guns facing Afghans. The guns of the West, the NATO, the guns of the Taliban, and the guns of the National Army of Afghanistan. And that was the approach for 20 years. Development on the sidelines was going on, and it was left to the Afghans, an institution and leaders that were very incompetent they were former warlords, or they were, you know, just Western technocrats that had little allegiance to the rural Afghans that were really the party in there. The cost to the West from disengagement, yes. First, it is a humanitarian crisis there, it's a liability, but the West will not remain secure if Afghanistan or countries like Afghanistan remain insecure. It's very much connected to the European security and defense policy. In a post-World War, Europe could not stay peaceful and secure if there were issues on outside Europe. And that's the way Europe dealt with it. It built governance, it built support, it built human security in parts of outside Europe that then will be affecting Europe. Migration will be happening. 50 to 60% of Afghans want to leave Afghanistan in the current circumstances where the West has again turned back to the country. There is incredible amount of insecurity and there is a lot of fear. 50, 60% means 20 million people, 7 million left in the Cold War, 7 million people, the brain drain that happened, 20 million. Is the West ready to have those numbers of migrants? Not just the neighboring countries, but they would want to find their way to Europe because that is safer. There are more opportunities here. Yeah, I'll stop here. And then global security concerns, a failed state in Afghanistan, an isolated state in Afghanistan, very much created the conditions for the emergence of the Taliban in the first place. Radicalization happened in that place. This can continue if a similar policy is taken and undertaken. Afghan civil society left alone in Afghanistan without any Western entities on the ground are fearful, they're afraid of the state because there is even not Western engagement in there. So, yeah, I'll stop here.
So maybe before we come back to the room here, there's a number of questions in the Zoom chat, which I'll follow up here because you mentioned also the regional environment. So the question is, what are the policy recommendations for the neighboring countries of Afghanistan? So as Afghans, what do you want from your neighboring countries? What policy recommendations do you have?
Maybe I will catch up on this. I think it goes similar recommendation as Moheb made for the international community. A similar recommendation goes to the neighboring countries. A safer Afghanistan means a safer Pakistan. A safer Afghanistan means safer Iran, China, and Russia. And they knew that, and they know that now also well. Because the backfire of supporting Taliban has been already sensed. There is a Pakistani Taliban movement in Pakistan who are now using the same strategy as has been used in Afghanistan. And Afghan Taliban already gave them this floor that, yes, we won the war, a war with 40 plus US nations who came to Afghanistan with all military utensils, failed, and we won the war. Why can't you not win the war? So the same appeal is that if they want to have a safe country for themselves, they have to also engage positively in Afghanistan. They have seen it. Pakistan is already experiencing, Iran is experiencing with IS. China is already experiencing this. And of course, Russia is also very keen on that.
Can I add to that? Sure. Yeah, I think three things I would say to all our neighbors. First, non-involvement, non-interference in Afghanistan's affairs, whether it's direct or indirect through proxy war, particularly in militaristic activities or approach looking into Afghanistan. Second, we have refugees there, and recent report says that they're mistreated. Those refugees are there because they could not live in Afghanistan. And as neighbors, they extend their human protection to people that have lived very difficult. Nobody wants to leave their home. They have been forced to leave it, and under any international convention, they need to be protected. And then finally, be more proactive in investing in Afghanistan. They are the neighbors. They know Afghanistan's economy and regional integration. Integrate into Afghanistan's economy, invest there, provide technical support in both investment and trading with and in Afghanistan. I'll stop here.
So maybe back to the the room here. Is there any question that has come up in the meantime here? Yeah, please.
I would like to come back to the neighbor question. I mean, I had the impression that you've not attributed Pakistan a particular role in the history of Afghanistan. I would like to ask you, how do you gauge and rate the policy of Pakistan during the past 50 years or so, 40 years? I mean, as far as I understand, there has been great impact. Is it not also a kind of expectation that Pakistan would completely change its attitude towards Afghanistan? Or is it simply one of the many neighbors that it was not very clear to me?
Can I just, as a non-expert on this neighbor, well, especially when it comes to the relationship with Pakistan and Afghanistan, and much of what I'm going to say is based on anecdotes and also my colleagues who have been experts, and I have been listening to them. When we say that Pakistan's policies, right, it's a very general statement to make. When we dig down into that one more, of course, it depends, because throughout time, if we put it in a spectrum, these policies keeps changing, and the source of this policy is not one. It's not like, for instance, in the parliament or in many of the political institutions in Pakistan, in the leadership, they will be like, okay, let's have this as a foreign policy in Pakistan. One of the things which has been recurring and it has come across is like the emergence or the training of the Taliban. Yes, there's this strong argument that they have been trained in Pakistan, but then the question is where in Pakistan? Because Fatah region, for instance, now of course the what you call the political legitimacy has changed. They are somehow under the control of the government and stuff. But a few, I think, decades ago, it wasn't. So did the government of Pakistan have control over that Fatah region where, for example, the Taliban were trained and stuff, and then they were sent to Afghanistan? So these questions, these nuances needs to be looked at before we can say that actually, and I know this is very controversial, before I can blame who are we blaming in Pakistan? That's the thing. And of course, there was this other account when from IPSO, he went to Afghanistan right after the Taliban took over, and they were like, "See, this is everybody, especially in social media, was saying, okay, this is why Pakistan is supporting Taliban, and they have to stop." It's the only thing I have to say is like it's more complicated, and it gets even more complex with the regime changes in Pakistan, and also we have to look at the time period. And based on that, we can come up with a proper solution in response to the relationship between Pakistan and Afghanistan. But yes, interference it has been a problem and it has to stop.
May I add this?
Sure, yes.
Pakistan, unfortunately, has always had troublesome relationship with Afghanistan. And I assume that you all know the history, right? Because the Durand line. Right, the Durand line that separates Pashtuns and Baloch on the both sides of the border. So that has created a troublesome, problematic relationship between Afghanistan and Pakistan, right? And if you see, Pakistan internally is facing lots of problems, right? There is Baloch and there are Pashtuns that they are minorities, and they really fight for their rights. So Pakistan always wants to have a government in Afghanistan that is more friendlier to them, because they see that if they have a strong Afghanistan on one side and an India or style India on the other side, so there will be sandwich in between, right? So that's why Afghanistan has always been a very important country for Pakistan. So that's why Pakistan has always interfered in the internal affairs of Afghanistan. And if you see that Pakistanis, when we are talking about Pakistan, I mean the military establishment and Pakistan establishment, not the ordinary people. So they always supported. They say that you are providing equal rights to our Pashtun minorities, but if you see, they have always supported the Pashtun religious movements, like Taliban, like Hizb Islami, the radical movement. They have never supported the Pashtun nationalist movement, like the Afghan Millat, and now the Pashtun Tahfuz movement, right? The PTM. They have never supported them because they see that those movements is also a threat for their internal security. Right? So that's why Pakistan has always had a problematic, kind of relationship with Afghanistan. And as you see that, the overall regime change in Pakistan also, Pakistan is also going through a lot of turmoil. So they cannot really afford to have two neighbors that are, kind of unfriendly. So that's why they always want to support a government that is more friendly. And also the other point, sorry, I wanted to mention. Taliban, right? They have been directly supported by Pakistan. There is a truth. But if you see right now in Taliban also, there is lots of fragmentation, there is also division. Why? Because the leadership of Taliban thinks something else, but the foot soldiers say something else. So for example, the Durand Line issue, right? Maybe the agenda of Pakistan was that if they have a regime like Taliban who are more friendly to them, so the Durand Line issue would be solved. But even if you see so far, Taliban hasn't said anything about Durand Line. Why? Because maybe the foot soldiers, they still have loyalty to their tribal affiliation, right? While the leadership is kind of more, they are supported by the Pakistanis, right? And the other thing is that when we are talking about Taliban, right? Of course, as my colleague mentioned, ethnically they are Pashtuns. We can't deny that. They are speaking Pashtun. But I just wanted to make that point in my presentation also, but by no way they can represent a Pashtun life. That's a total misrepresentation that is going on in the media, and unfortunately to non-Afghan audience, they think that Pashtuns and Taliban are equal. They are not. They are ethnically Pashtun, but by no way they can represent Pashtun way of life. The first thing Taliban, when they took power in 1996, the first thing they did, that they stopped the practice of Pashtunwali, they stopped the practice of Jirgas. I'm not advocating for Pashtunwali because Pashtunwali also has lots of negative component to it, right? But I'm just saying that they killed all the tribal leaders, and instead they put mullahs in charge. They gave more power to mullahs and to mosques. While in a traditional Pashtun society, mullahs never had that much power. And also the way they are flogging women on the street, that would be unimaginable in a Pashtun society. Because in a Pashtun society, even everything is in a domestic affair. It's not, you're not allowed to especially disrespect a woman on public. So they by no way they can represent the Pashtun way of life.
Thank you very much. Unfortunately, I think we're starting to come to a close, so I think there's one more question I will put to you, which is coming from the Zoom chat. It's a combination of two questions. So the first part is, what can Afghan civilians now do to contribute to peace, and especially what's the future of Afghan women? And do you think a Western model of women's emancipation is best suitable for the Afghan case? And I think the second part is quite different. Is how do you see a viable state building model for Afghanistan, which is independent from something that is imposed by the West in Afghanistan? Any papers?
I would take the state building. I think because this is my research project, my book published on 27th September, The State Building Dilemma in Afghanistan, and this covers the whole topic. And I did a field research on this, what would be an alternative state model, the one we had experienced so far. Well, the current situation, I think it's very difficult to recommend any state model because the ruling group in Kabul, they are not agreed to any other recommendation other than Islamic Emirate, which just does not have any history in the Afghan context. It's just an Arab state model that is not incorporated the Afghan culture and society. So it's a different thing. But if we just take the previous government that we have, a strong centralized system in Afghanistan, that was a big mistake. And I think for a multicultural, multi-religious society like Afghanistan, we need somehow kind of decentralized state system. I'm not when I'm talking about decentralized, the moment I say this also in Afghanistan, people automatically think of a strong parliamentary federal system. That's also not possible in Afghanistan because the ethnic groups are really interlinked and divided differently, that you cannot say, okay, we make a ethnic-based political system, federal system, where each ethnic group could decide upon their own fate. But a decentralized state system would at least give each ethnic group the possibility to represent their own people in the central state and at the same time in the provincial level. So that was the proposal in my research I made before the collapse of the regime, but now it turned to be a dream. But still, if the international community put pressure and call upon the Taliban to engage back into this peace process, I think there is a possibility that we could somehow change the course of discourse from an emirate to a somehow decentralized state system.
I would comment on the Jindal.
Sure, yeah.
Post-2001 development, it's not like nothing has happened, right? We had lots of achievement post-2001, and we have to admit it, right? And especially in the sector of education and health, and the exposure that people have got, the scholarships that the West and the neighboring countries gave, and we are the product of those scholarships, right? We wouldn't have been able to study without support, right? So there have been lots of achievements, and of course, women's rights. Women's rights was in a top priority agenda of the West, right? But the only thing is that the women's right that we have, it's not entirely the gift of the West. Pre-Islamization, pre-radicalization, women, they had rights in Afghanistan, right? If you see, in the time of King Amanullah Khan, and the Queen Suraya was a very important figure of women emancipation, right? And then they, for the first time in the region, it was they were Afghan women that they got the right to vote. So political participation in the region was first time given to the Afghan women, right? So it was not entirely the gift of the West, but of course, post-2001 development enhanced those rights. They helped Afghan civil society and women's rights activists to enhance their activities. But the mistake or the drawback was that when funds came in post-2011, those funds, because I worked in the NGO sector for many years, they would come with the pre-designed project. Pre-designed project means that the women's rights, for example, they would say that we have to conduct 10 women's rights training in span of 2 months, for example, right? And they would go, for example, to poor villages where people don't have anything to eat, where men are jobless, and they would ask those women to come for a women's rights training. So this was a totally wrong, priorities. How do we expect those people who don't have anything to eat to come and participate in a women's rights training? And the second thing is that if you don't involve men, especially men in a traditional society like Afghanistan, right? How do we expect a family to respect their female rights? First, men should be involved, and then gender sensitization and women's rights training. So there was missed priorities in the in the project, and as we all see that those projects are unfortunately were not sustainable. So for the future, the recommendation should be that if funds come, donors come, they have to first do some kind of assessment. And the projects that they are designing, it should be matching the ground reality. It should not be totally a module that is implemented in the West. So the ground reality should be taken into consideration, the cultural context should be taken into consideration, and then the project should be implemented.
Thank you very much. I think this at least gives a loop back to swisspeace, which tries to take conflicts and very seriously, and what you're suggesting here as well. Unfortunately, it's 4 o'clock, so we're coming to a close here. I would still like each of the participants to, if you have maybe a final statement, a brief final statement, to please go ahead with that before we close this roundtable.
Well, the only thing that I want to say is that don't forget Afghanistan. We don't want the history to be right. and we don't want Afghanistan to go back to civil war also. So, international community in Afghan exile and civil society in Afghanistan, they all should work together to make Afghanistan a peaceful country.
I would say it's not just about Afghanistan, it's about humanity in general. So if anything that we know that can prevent any catastrophe for the future of humanity, if we know we can stop it, and if we think Afghanistan at this moment, it can be a catastrophe, which it was in the past, we have to do something about it now. And it's not just about Afghanistan, it's about everybody in the globe. So that's, yeah, thank you.
Well, as I discussed, Afghanistan is both a Western liability and it is a Western concern, very deeply connected to Western security. Forgetting and turning back to Afghanistan in the 90s after the Cold War created a lot of dilemmas and unfortunately resulted in a 9/11. Similar approach need to be avoided. The West needs to look at Afghanistan from its own need for security. And the development of Afghanistan should be a priority, both through financial resources, but also a commitment, an engagement in that country with authorities, regardless of who they are now. They are the reality. The Taliban are a reality in Afghanistan. Engage with them in the country to be more pluralistic in governing Afghanistan. Any governing system that we need to develop in Afghanistan should be Afghan owned, Afghan led, Afghan decided. We have had constitutions in the past. Similar systems need to be developed in Afghanistan, and we would like the West to be present, not sanction Afghanistan. It has by de facto sanctioned the country of 40 million people who live in deep insecurity, human insecurity. Thank you. I'll stop here.
Yeah, I think it's all our last recommendations. I think probably the same that if we forget Afghanistan, we will go back to 2001. On that time, we had Taliban harbor one terrorist organization, and today we have dozens of them that have already existed, including IS. Their numbers are increasing, their attacks are increasing. And that's not only a threat to Afghanistan, but to the regional countries and to the national society. We have seen the example in Syria and Iraq, that war started there, but it came to the Europe cities, centers, to Berlin, to Paris, to United States, different cities. We have experienced that. So that would continue if we ignore Afghanistan. And I just want to make last statement. The consensus was, after the collapse of the regime, the international community made a joint statement that we would not recognize Taliban regime unless they comply to what they expect, the human rights and inclusive government, women's rights and minority rights. But unfortunately, with the outbreak of war in Ukraine, the whole focus of the international community gone to Ukraine and Russian conflict. And now it's a very good chance for the regional powers. And unfortunately, this also affected because now Russia, China, Pakistan, and Iran unofficially, officially surrendered or submitted the Afghan embassies to the Taliban. They are officially recognized state, but not declared yet. So it's already accepted, it's already recognized. So if the West is forgetting that, there will be soon more engagement from these anti-US, anti-West parties, and we cannot if we don't engage now, saying we in the West, we will yet create another human catastrophe, not only in Afghanistan, but in the whole region and the world. Thank you very much.
Thank you. And I think with this rather bleak outlook, unfortunately, we come to a close here. Rest to say that thanks again to all the panelists here for your very valuable contributions, for the discussions here in the room, but also the participants online who followed us. Thanks a lot for joining us, for your questions and following the discussion. And for those who already asked in the chat, the event has been recorded, so it will be made available to you on our website as well if you want to follow certain parts of the discussion again. So thanks again to all of you, and good afternoon.